Well, first of all, thank you, Ian. I need to note my appreciation to Peter Harrison for inviting me to this conference, and to the Ian Ramsey Center and the Center for the History of European Discourses at the University of Brisbane for their sponsorship of this conference. And I also need to add an additional note of thanks to both Peter and Ian for their editorial efforts, which Ian has already referred to. And actually, this is the second time Ian has attempted to push me in various directions, because there was also a piece I wrote in connection with a very important enterprise, the 5-volume Oxford History of Historical Writing that Ian was involved in. This paper is I'm going to present this paper. My presentation will be much less professional than that of our most recent presenters. This paper is still, to some extent, in process. I really only started it at the end of the semester, though it does deal with issues that I have thought about for quite a while. So let's take it away. The evolutionary epic emerged before Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, and it flourished after that date. Versions of the evolutionary epic flourish today in different variants and under different names. The old and the new evolutionary epics have common features that justify our seeing them as a single phenomenon. And will this work? It did. Okay, wonderful. These features are, one, a fixation on looking at human beings in terms of their connection to biological factors, and in many instances in terms of their connection to the evolution of the physical universe going back to its beginnings. Two, an aspiration toward offering not the whole story of the world and of human beings up to now, but the outlines of that story, or if not quite the outlines, then a set of theoretical propositions on the basis of which such a story or story outline might be constructed. And three, an insistence on seeing the projected narrative of the world and of human beings as unified and coherent, such that even when there are ruptures in the narrative, the basic determining factors continue to operate, and the events of the narrative continue to constitute a process and not simply a collection of discontinuous happenings. The beginnings of the evolutionary epic have generally been traced, the beginnings of the genre, that is, have generally been traced back to the publication in 1844 of Robert Chambers's Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, but its greatest period of popular flourishing occurred after 1859. By the end of the 1890s, the genre had pretty much, I think, I'm not absolutely sure about this, had pretty much run its course insofar as originality was concerned, although a market for works in the genre continued to exist and even flourish well into the 20th century. In the last 40 years, the genre has been reborn and has emerged with a new vigor not seen since the last third of the 19th century. The scholar most responsible for this rebirth is the Harvard entomologist and sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson, who in On Human Nature, 1978, gave the genre its name, the evolutionary epic. Subsequently, historians of science and literature, noticing similarities between Wilson's epic project and the work of an interesting subset of Victorian writers, applied the new label to this older set of works. There are strong reasons why we who are interested in questions of purpose, order, rationality, and contingency in the natural and human worlds, as well as in the relations between religion and science, ought to cast an analytical eye on the evolutionary epic. Of course, one thing needs to be said right away. The genre is scientifically problematic. It puts forward claims that go far beyond what could ever be justified in the way that normal scientific theories are justified, or indeed, for that matter, normal historical narratives are justified. And yet its proponents insist that it is justified, although perhaps not entirely justified, by scientific facts and theories. The problematic character of the evolutionary epic alone makes it worth the price of admission, especially since many of its proponents have indeed been aware of the difficulties that surround it. My concern here is not to attack the evolutionary epic, but rather to gain insight from its difficulties. These difficulties are historically and philosophically revelatory, and this is all the more so when we are able to view in tandem the old and the new evolutionary epics. One of the most interesting facts about the old evolutionary epic is that in the wake of the publication of On the Origin of Species, its practitioners found themselves caught between competing scientific and ontological commitments. Many of the 19th century contributors to the genre were philosophically astute, although none of them identified himself or herself as a philosopher, so far as I know. In this respect, they had a leg up on the proponents of the present-day evolutionary epic, who may be better scientists than were their 19th century predecessors, but are worse philosophers. This is probably not the result of a decline in intelligence since the 19th century. More plausibly, it results from our growing intellectual division of labor, which diminishes the likelihood that a practicing scientist or historian will be attuned to philosophical issues or will hear philosophical criticism. In On the Origin of Species, Darwin proposed, against the dominant Linnaean paradigm, a new paradigm, which we can call descent with modification, for pursuing natural history research and for organizing natural historical knowledge. These two paradigms were subtended, I contend, by two radically opposed ontological positions that need to be distinguished from the paradigms themselves. By a paradigm, I mean an approach to doing science, or alternatively, an approach to viewing that segment of the world upon which the science is done. Precisely because it was evolutionary, the evolutionary epic was negatively related to the Linnaean paradigm of natural history, which utterly denied that species could evolve. Conversely, with the publication of Darwin's Origin, exponents of the evolutionary epic had a seeming ally, given that the whole intent of Darwin's work was to deny that the forms of organic life are fixed and immutable. But in fact, the relation of the evolutionary epic to Darwin was deeply ambivalent. Back in 1979, Neil Gillespie suggested that we can better understand the conceptual situation surrounding Darwin's work if we distinguish between paradigms and the deeper underpinnings of paradigms. Gillespie argued that the competing Linnaean and Darwinian paradigms hooked onto broader and deeper sets of commitments that Gillespie designated as epistemes. In the present paper, I shall take an episteme to be a set of commitments so wide-ranging and so deeply accepted that for most people, most of the time, at a given time and place, it amounts to the unquestioned core of a worldview. As anyone who has even so much as glanced at Linnaeus' Systema Naturae will know, the Linnaean paradigm, which saw description and classification as the essential task of the natural historian, had a close relation to the theistic notion that the world is suffused by divine purpose. To state this another way, the scientific paradigm that we call classificationism was supported by a broader set of commitments that I shall here designate as the episteme of idealism. By idealism, I mean the view that some sort of divine or quasi-divine intention, purpose, or, speaking generally, idea is embedded within the universe. And note, of course, I'm perfectly aware there are other meanings of idealism, but I've just given you the meaning that I'm deploying in this particular paper. Linnaeus was unequivocally an idealist in this sense. He believed that there was a divine purpose embedded within the universe. As I shall show below, the coherence of the evolutionary epic, if it is to be taken as the authoritative grand narrative of the world and of man, depends on idealist assumptions. People who have read On the Origin of Species with care and have thought about what Darwin says will know that Darwin's theory had absolutely nothing to do with the notion that divine idea or purpose suffuses the universe. Indeed, the theory has nothing to do with intention or purpose at all. So there is an irony here. The Linnaean paradigm was incompatible with the evolutionary epic, since it denied that organisms evolve, rather they were created as is, but it was also compatible with the evolutionary epic, since it saw the universe as the product of an overarching divine plan. As for Darwin's theory, it was at the same time both compatible and incompatible with the evolutionary epic for exactly the contrary reasons. Now, a new section, a present-day evolutionary epic, E.O. Wilson. Lovely, okay. In recent years, some historians of science and literature have, as I said, become interested in the 19th century evolutionary epic. But the first thing that we need to notice in the new evolutionary epic. And I want to now focus on the new evolutionary epic. The first thing we really need to notice, I think, that we really need to look at is the new evolutionary epic, because I think we can gain some insight on the old evolutionary epic by starting with E.O. Wilson. It seems to me that we can learn about things about the new evolutionary epic. There are certain absences from the new evolutionary epic that I think become very visible when we have looked at the old evolutionary epic. And conversely, I think there are things we can see in the old evolutionary epic that a glance at Wilson will help us to discern. E.O. Wilson originated the dominant present-day version of the evolutionary epic. He gained his academic reputation, of course, as I'm sure you all know, via his extraordinarily thorough study of ants. Then at a certain point, the thought occurred to him that it makes sense to look at human beings in relation to the behavior of ants. That there's something about looking at ants and looking at human beings. After spending all those years, all that effort on the study of ants, he said to himself, well, maybe I can say something intelligent about human beings on the basis of my experience with ants. He thus moved from being a zoologist to being, in addition, a social theorist. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that Wilson's entire career as a social theorist has been based on an analogization of the behavior of insects with the behavior and action of human beings. One can see this analogization in the title of the first work in which he referred to sociobiology, The Insect Societies. Its final chapter is devoted to the prospects for a unified sociobiology. As Wilson restated it a few years later, his suggestion was that the same principles of population biology and comparative zoology that have worked so well in explaining the rigid systems of the social insects could be applied point by point to vertebrate animals. 4 years after The Insect Societies, Wilson published in 1975 Sociobiology, A New Synthesis. Here he aimed to promote a new discipline based on the claim that human social behavior and human nature itself have a biological foundation. Indeed, that human nature should be understood biologically. In other words, inspired by his study of the social behavior of ants, he turned to the social behavior of human beings, offering nothing less than, as he says, a new synthesis, or at least a new attempted synthesis of biology and sociology. Wilson introduced the term evolutionary epic in the final chapter of his 1978 book Of Human Nature, entitled significantly Hope. Here he explicitly stated that the evolutionary epic is a myth that he sees as growing out of his commitment to what he calls scientific naturalism, and also another term he uses very frequently as a designator of his position, materialism. The essential claim that Wilson makes on human nature is that scientific naturalism has the capacity to explain traditional religion, its chief competitor, as a wholly material phenomenon. Theology, Wilson suggests, is not likely to survive as an independent intellectual discipline in the face of scientific naturalism. But he suggests that religion, as distinguished from theology, will endure for a long time as a vital force in society. According to Wilson, while scientific naturalism, or materialism, or if you want to call it, this is another Wilsonian term, humanism, his terminology floats a lot, gives a correct account of the world, but it is ideologically weak. Quoting Wilson, humanists will never enjoy the hot pleasures of spiritual conversion and self-surrender. Scientists cannot, in all honesty, serve as priests. Of course, well, we can think about that and counter instances to that. So what is a humanist to do? Or as Wilson asks, does a way exist to divert the power of religion into the services of the great new enterprise that lays bare the sources of that power? Wilson's answer, surprisingly enough, is yes. We need to combine the findings of biology with those of the social sciences. Neurobiology and its companion disciplines tell us that the mind is more precisely explained as an epiphenomenon of the neuronal machinery of the brain. Moreover, this machinery is and I quote now at some length, is the product of genetic evolution by natural selection acting on human populations for hundreds of thousands of years in their ancient environments. By a judicious extension of the methods and ideas of neurobiology, ethology, and sociobiology, a proper foundation can be laid for the social sciences, and the discontinuity still separating the natural sciences on the one side and the social sciences and humanities on the other will be erased. Now that's the gist of Wilson's scientific materialism, his commitment to the view that the ultimately determining element in human society is the biological element. As Wilson says elsewhere in the book, ideology bows to its hidden master, the genes. Wilson contends that the scientific ethos by which these truths have been discovered is superior to religion, as can be seen from the many successes of that ethos. Notably, its repeated triumphs in explaining and controlling the physical world, its self-correcting nature open to all the competent to devise and conduct the tests, its readiness to examine all subjects sacred and profane, and now the possibility of explaining traditional religion by the mechanistic models of evolutionary biology. Now I'm going to skip a little bit and continue onward. Wilson points out that the claims of sociobiology cannot be proved with finality. And so the evolutionary epic is not a set of scientifically justified conclusions. Rather, it is a myth. Indeed, it is probably the best myth we will ever have. It is a myth that can be adjusted until it comes as close to truth as the human mind is constructed to judge the truth. Wilson goes on to suggest that the mythopoeic requirements of the mind must somehow be met by scientific materialism so as to reinforce our superb energies. One way of bringing about such a connection, he asserts, is by cultivating more intensely the relationship between the sciences and the humanities. Now I skip a bit. Nietzsche contra the evolutionary epic. To start with Wilson is to start a long way down the road. Going back to the 19th century helps us to reflect more clearly on the presuppositions that originally made the evolutionary epic possible. A good starting point is the most uncompromising critic of the 19th century idealist episteme, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Nietzsche loathed idealism. He was also a critic of the evolutionary epic. Fundamental to the evolutionary epic is the assumption that the world is so ordered that it can in principle be captured by a grand overarching narrative, unified by its culmination in a single telos, albeit a telos whose future end we cannot see. How can we justifiably say that such a coherence can exist other than by holding that there is some sort of ruling intention at work? And how could such an intention be anything other than a rational intention, guaranteeing the rationality and order of the universe? I'm asking those questions. That's not quite Nietzsche, but he's asking them too. Nietzsche's opposition to the evolutionary epic operated on multiple levels. On one level, he was offended by the millions of Germans who cheered Bismarck's cunning creation in 1871 of the German Reich, and who thought of Germany and Christendom as standing at the peak of human history. This alone was enough to turn Nietzsche against any view that saw the universe as moving in an improving direction. How, after all, could 19th century Germans, of all people, stand higher than the ancient Greeks? But in looking at Nietzsche, we need also to plumb to a deeper level. In one of his best, most lucid works, Daybreak, Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality, 1881, Nietzsche issued a clarion call against the evolutionary epic in the following terms. The new fundamental feeling, our conclusive transitoriness. Formerly, one sought the feeling of the grandeur of man by pointing to his divine origin. This has now become a forbidden way, for at its portal stands the ape, together with other gruesome beasts, grinning knowingly as if to say, no further in this direction. One therefore now tries the opposite direction. The way mankind is going shall serve as proof of his grandeur and kinship with God. Alas, this too is vain. However high mankind may have evolved, and perhaps at the end it will stand even lower than at the beginning, it cannot pass over into a higher order as little as the ant and the earwig can, at the end of its earthly course, rise up to kinship with God and eternal life. There's the ant-thematic making its appearance. In Daybreak, Nietzsche also assaults various assumptions that are required for the existence of an evolutionary epic, and I'll give you a little bit to look at there on screen. He particularly focuses on the notion of necessity. He denies that the usefulness of a thing in any way makes it comprehensible that a thing must necessarily exist. He insists again and again on the supremacy of chance in the world, on the purely chance character of events. He attacks the notion that what appears as rationality is anything more than pure happenstance, and hence we get rationality. How did rationality arrive in the world? Irrationally, as might be expected, by a chance accident. If we want to know what that chance accident was, we shall have to guess it, as one guesses the answer to a riddle. So rationality, crumbled, deconstructed, one could say. Purpose, too, is one of Nietzsche's targets. In a passage of Daybreak that uncannily reproduces a line of thinking that the early Darwin articulated but did not publish, so far as I know, Nietzsche wrote as follows: "Purposes in nature. The impartial investigator who pursues the history of the eye and the forms it has assumed among the lowest creatures, who demonstrates the whole step-by-step evolution of the eye, must arrive at the great conclusion that vision was not the intention behind the creation of the eye, but that vision appeared rather after chance had put the apparatus together. A single instance of this kind and purposes fall away like scales from the eyes." Here Nietzsche is reacting in two different ways against his intellectual contemporaries. Firstly, he is offering a commentary on his contemporaries' views concerning the organic world. He attacks two notions: the notion that any sort of intention or purpose was at work in the coming into being of organisms, and the notion that what happens on the organic front happens necessarily. This is the double meaning of Nietzsche's insistence that vision was not the intention behind the creation of the eye, but appeared rather after chance had put the apparatus together. In other words, Nietzsche attacks both the notion that organic life is the product of divine intention and the notion that there was any sort of necessity in the emergence of organic life. To say that organisms emerged by chance is to say that their emergence was not rational, assuming that one accepts the notion, widely adhered to in the Western philosophical tradition from Aristotle onward, that necessity is an important criterion of rationality. In short, Nietzsche attacks two targets here: the notion that the organic world is to be understood as the instantiation of an overarching divine purpose, and the notion that the organic world's process of emergence is to be understood as rational. These observations on Nietzsche's part need to be understood in a broader context, as not restricted to organisms, but as applying to the universe in general. In other words, Nietzsche was attacking two positions that we can call ontological, although he would have rejected that term as reeking of a Kantian two-worlds view. In the context of European theory in the 19th century, these two positions overlapped with and reinforced each other. One position is commitment to the notion of embedded rationality. This is the view either that the world is inherently rational, or that we are so constituted that we are able to, and are also under an implicit obligation to, conceptualize the world as if it were rational, and that latter possibility is Kant. This view was held by many Western philosophers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Indeed, one has to look rather closely to find the outliers, those thinkers who rejected this orthodoxy, and it was an orthodoxy. In the 19th century, the two who come most forcefully to mind are Schopenhauer, who in The World as Will and Representation, 1818, portrayed a universe driven by a completely irrational, quasi-sexual will that is insatiable in its meaningless desires. And of course, Nietzsche. The other position is commitment to the notion that the world is a product of divine intention. This position was fundamental to the Linnaean tradition of natural history. For example, it is clear from the introitus of the Systema Naturae that Linnaeus conceived of his enterprise of classifying animals, plants, and we often forget also minerals, as an act of divine worship. Moreover, the argument from design, developed by other thinkers, which put divine intention at center stage, was closely integrated into pre-Darwinian natural history. The most widely read presentation of the design argument was William Paley's Natural Theology, 1802. Paley took it as self-evident that a law presupposes an agent. Right? He declared also that anything showing an end, a purpose, adaptation to the purpose, requires the intending mind, the adapting hand. In other words, there is adaptation in Paley, but it's a completely idealistic adaptation. And Paley also rejected the opposing view, the view that would say, oh no, there's no adapting hand, it's pure mechanical cause or chance. He rejects that position with the frightening words, this is atheism. Admittedly, Paley was a theologian, not a naturalist, but the naturalists were also committed to the design argument. And indeed, Darwin read Paley as part of his theological study. Charles Darwin's eventual friend, Charles Lyell, was explicitly an idealist. In the first volume of Principles of Geology, published in 1830, and Darwin took it, I believe, on the voyage of the Beagle, Charles Lyell supposes that when the author of nature creates an animal or plant, he foresees all the possible circumstances in which its descendants are destined to live. Louis Agassiz asserted that the existence of useless organisms, such as the teeth of whales and the nipples of males of the class Mammalia, is evidence of a divine unity of plan in nature, and so on, and so on, and so on. It was just replete within the natural historical tradition before Darwin was this notion of divine intention and purpose manifested in the organic world. To say that the world manifests divine purpose is not the same as saying that it manifests an embedded rationality, or vice versa. Notably, Karl Marx did not root his deep commitment to world rationality in theism. But Marx was atypical in this respect. For most 19th century thinkers, the two positions were utterly congruent and were usually co-present, with God conceptualized as a rational God whose creation likewise must be rational. This is what allowed Nietzsche to link together, for purposes of attack, the notion that the world is inherently rational and the notion that it is permeated by purpose. Now, in looking at the old evolutionary epic, and we'll get to some instances shortly. In looking at the old evolutionary epic, we need to bear in mind the common features of the evolutionary epic in general. These are, as noted at the beginning, a fixation on looking at human beings in relation to the material universe, an aspiration toward offering the outlines, at least, of the whole story of human beings up to now, and an insistence on the coherence of the projected narrative and of the process that the narrative purports to describe. The issue of coherence is crucial here. The coherence needs to be grounded in something. Idealism offered this grounding via two avenues. Firstly, many proponents of the evolutionary epic appealed to the unity of an overarching divine intention. And secondly, whether or not they appealed to the divine author, they were able to appeal to the laws of nature. It was held by many 19th century thinkers that the laws of nature exist in nature, most likely put into nature by God. They are not simply correlations that we develop in our own minds, they are actually in nature. As Maurice Mandelbaum said in his book History, Man and Reason, 1971, a much neglected but very valuable book, these laws were widely seen, the laws of nature were widely seen in this period as operative principles that actually govern the world. Further, as Mandelbaum also noted, quite a few 19th century thinkers advanced the further claim that one of the basic laws of nature was a law of progress. Now, next section, how Darwin's theory did not support the evolutionary epic. And I'm going to, let's see what we got here. Right, okay. If we are to properly assess Darwin's relation to the evolutionary epic, we need to plumb on the origin of species. In particular, we need to attend to the glaring fissure that runs through it. Here, the intellectual historian must express gratitude for the uncompromising way that Nietzsche pursued and proclaimed the truth as he saw it. In the biting air of his best writing, we are helped to see the world with an unaccustomed clarity. Above all, Nietzsche makes clear the gulf between idealism's commitment to the underlying rationality of the world and the opposing position which denied everything that idealism proclaimed. I call that opposing position anti-idealism, although with a note of caution, we might also call it materialism. But materialism has various other meanings that sometimes go off in a direction not appropriate here. In Nietzsche's perspective, the conclusion is inescapable. The right position is anti-idealism, a complete rejection of embedded rationality and of purposiveness. But what of Darwin? Was Darwin a Nietzschean avant les lettres? And the answer here is obvious. No, he wasn't. But Darwin did approach Nietzsche in a certain way. The historian of science David Cohen draws attention to the fact that in a draft of Darwin's 1844 essay, in which Darwin, fearing that he might die prematurely, laid out the essential points of his theory. In that essay, he explicitly suggested that a very complex organ, namely the eye, might have emerged completely non-intentionally and by pure chance, by the operation of material forces alone. As he often did, Darwin asked his pious wife Emma to read the manuscript, and when she encountered Darwin's suggestion that, quote, no art or skill whatever has been concerned in the business of the emergence of the eye, she wrote in the margin, quote, a great assumption, capital E period, capital D period. An understated, but clearly intensely negative response to Darwin's daring materialist sally. Cohen notes that after Darwin worked hard to obscure, well, did he work hard to obscure his idealism, or did he just obscure his idealism? I don't know how intentional it was, but Darwin never spoke so materialistically, so far as I know, any time after that draft of the 1844 essay. His work, The Origin of Species, obscures the completely non-intentionalist, non-purposive, anti-choice, anti-teleological, anti-idealist, materialistic character of his theory. Well-informed Darwin scholars do not need to be told what Darwin's theory is. Almost all other readers do need to be told because misunderstanding of Darwin's theory is rife in popular culture. People are led astray by bad education and by a tendency that humans have toward anthropomorphizing almost everything. They are also led astray by Darwin's profoundly misleading language, which can be taken as asserting that organisms adapt to their environments, like successful immigrants, that species struggle and compete, just like American entrepreneurs, that nature selects some organisms and rejects others, and that the fittest survive. All these descriptions of Darwin's theory are both blatantly false and widely assumed to be correct. However, it is perfectly possible to restate the theory in such a way as to eliminate all activist, purposivist, teleological language. Indeed, it is obligatory to do so, I think, for the organisms covered by the theory are assumed by the very terms of the theory to operate non-purposively. In this sense, now, of course, there are different senses of purposive, and by purposiveness, by purposivity, the capacity to be purposive, I mean the capacity to look beyond one's environment to some other possibility outside that environment. The organisms covered by the theory are assumed to be not capable of thinking and planning beyond the extant environment within which they happen to live. Now, I've put down sort of the gist of Darwin's theory, and perhaps I can run through this just very quickly. First, there is variation. Darwin doesn't try to explain variation. Well, he does try to explain it, because he thinks people expect him to explain why there is variation, but he doesn't have a clue why there's variation. All he needs is the fact of variation, that different organisms of the same population are generally different in some way or other from each other. Fact, there is inheritance. Fact, organisms have a strong instinctual propensity toward reproductive behavior, and they've got no choice in this. They just do it. And then one gets to the next item, part fact, part hypothesis. In the natural environment, at any given time and place, the resources needed for the survival of an organism are limited. Then we have an inference that we get by putting together 3 and 4. In the resultant situation of limited resources, some organisms will die relatively quickly, other organisms will survive longer, producing more offspring. And then we have the big hypothesis. Those organisms that survive longer are those that happen to have inherited variations that happen to make them relatively more suited to the existing environment than other organisms are. And then we go on to the next slide, number 7. Assuming that there is some degree of stability over time in the environment, there will be a gradual accumulation of variations that will make the organisms being born later relatively better suited to than their forebears were to the extant environment. Conversely, unfavorable variations, that is, variations that will make survival more difficult under those circumstances, will tend to disappear. Now, those propositions, it seems to me, add up to Darwin's theory. I think that's Darwin's theory in a nutshell. There's other stuff in The Origin of Species, but that's the theory. I think it's simple stuff. I think it's Darwin 101. And notice the theory allows no space for intentionality toward a telos. Hence, it cannot support the notion of a coherent process of evolution aimed toward a single, perhaps always developing end. Yes, organisms do seem to have an instinctual drive towards survival, but that drive does not overstep the narrative of the life of a single individual. Alternatively, one might derive a single coherent process from this completely materialist theory if one were to assume that the environment toward which organisms get adapted, and they don't adapt. I mean, species don't adapt. First of all, species actually don't exist. It is that organisms get adapted. They get adapted if the situation is such they're getting adapted, that they're getting adapted to an environment that remains essentially the same, then one could see a long-range directionality, and perhaps, I don't think one could call it a telos, but certainly one could see a long-range directionality in the process. But there's no reason to believe that the environment will remain unchanged. In fact, there's a lot of reason to believe, in terms of the theory, that in terms of the theory itself, that the environment will change. Fitness, and of course this is well known, I'm almost embarrassed to say this in front of this crowd, fitness in Darwin is always fitness in relation to the existing environment. If the organisms covered by Darwin's theory were capable of planning ahead, then adaptation could be to an envisaged future environment. But by definition, the theory excludes that possibility. It is about traits that are heritable, not about choosing and planning. We cannot inherit choosing our choices and our plans, though perhaps we might be able to inherit some sort of capacity to choosing and planning. In short, what we have here is, in its own terms, a completely anti-idealist theory. Now, I go to the next part of the paper, the radically different presuppositions of the old and of the new evolutionary epochs. The complete anti-idealism, aka materialism, of Darwin's theory raises the question, how in the wake of Darwin did the proponents of the 19th century evolutionary epoch manage to justify what they were doing? This question is not only historically interesting, it is also relevant to the question as to what justifies the present-day evolutionary epoch, and it is ultimately to this question that I shall turn. The evolutionary epoch takes the physical and biological world as fundamental. That is its focus. If the focus were instead on the purposive doings of human beings operating in their social worlds, it would be easy to imagine a human epoch whose coherence would arise from its fixating on a collective human project, typically involving increase of knowledge, freedom, and mastery over nature. Indeed, a surprising number of 19th century writers thought along just such lines. Among the most prominent were Hegel, Auguste Comte, and Karl Marx, but many other names could be added. Note that the purposiveness of this tradition, you see, there's the evolutionary epoch tradition with its materialist focus, and then there's another tradition, Hegel, Comte, Marx, although Marx is frequently understood, and various others, who see an intellectual tradition in work, and it's an intellectual tradition that does get applied to the human social world. The evolutionary epoch is quite different from this. It's not an intellectual history of the advance of man. It is noteworthy that when Chambers' Vestiges of Creation, of the Natural History of Creation, was published in 1844, becoming an instant bestseller, the eminent geologist and Christian divine, there's a guy who was a scientist and a priest, Adam Sedgwick, found in it a rank, unbending, and degrading materialism. That is, Sedgwick accusing Chambers, who was unknown at the time, he was anonymous, of a materialism. But Sedgwick's reaction to Chambers was utterly unfair. Yes, Chambers focused on the material world, but to focus on the material world does not necessarily make one a materialist, just as Marx's interest in the forces of material production does not make him a materialist. In fact, Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation was permeated by idealism, and it was the idealism of the Vestiges that made it work as an evolutionary epoch. The very possibility of an evolutionary epoch moving coherently from the nebula or from the Big Bang to human society depends on idealism. How indeed could one imagine the notion that there's a coherent process at work in the material world without attributing purpose either to nebulae solar winds, meteor showers, movements of the Earth crust, microbes, genes, and so on. And some people do this. I mean, Bruno Latour has on occasion attributed intention to microbes. It's a possible counterfactual, imaginative option. But that's not quite what we find in the 19th century idealist tradition, 19th century evolutionary epic tradition. Man, Chambers insists, is a progressive being, and what pleases him today may not please him tomorrow. So that's Chambers on man. John Stuart Mill, no adherent of the evolutionary epic, likewise referred to man as a progressive being, very famously in his On Liberty of 1859. But Chambers goes much further than Mill. Chambers has a different position than Mill's position later. Chambers unites man and nature, holding not only man, but indeed the entirety of nature to be progressive. Nature, Chambers insists, operates according to laws that are uniform throughout space and are established on a rigidly accurate mathematical basis. Confronted by these facts, confronted by our observation of the laws of nature at work, an intelligent mind seeks to advance from law to the cause of law, asking, whence have come all these beautiful regulations? The conclusion is inevitable, according to Chambers, that there is a first cause to which all others are secondary and administrative, a primitive almighty will of which these laws are merely the mandates. Further, given the recognized character of the deity, it is necessary to suppose that the present system is but a part of a whole, a stage in a great progress. I could say more about Chambers, but perhaps it's not necessary to do so. For what one could say about Chambers is confirmed when one looks at other later contributors to the genre, the 19th century genre of the evolutionary epic. So yes, he focuses on material elements. They're very important to him. It's geology and natural history. But the idea there is that God is subtending the entire process. There is a divine idea that made even the laws of nature. Bernard Lightman has noted that the 19th century evolutionary epic derived its scientific legitimacy from the concept of evolution as a gradual, lawful, and progressive development in the natural world. Obviously, the lawfulness in question was of the kind that Mandelbaum has described, an embedded lawfulness rooted in the natural world through God's creation and manifesting his will. As Paley had pointed out, at least had claimed, a law presupposes an agent. This was worlds away from Darwin, who rejected the laws as embedded view of law in favor of the view that a law is simply the sequence of events as ascertained by us. Now, how are we doing on time? I can skip ahead, and I think I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip ahead.
Well, maybe 10 more minutes or so.
Okay. So I'm passing over some details of various adherents, practitioners of the evolutionary epic in the 19th century. Basically, this is secondary to Bernie Lightman's book of a couple of years ago, which includes a great chapter on the evolutionary epic. I'm skipping over David Page, Arabella Buckley, Edward Claude, and Grant Allan. And I think I'm also going to skip over Spencer. But I think I should say a few words about Spencer, because one might think of Spencer as being, well, one wouldn't perhaps think of him at first thought as a materialist, but one certainly wouldn't think of him as particularly friendly to Christianity. And there is that story. Is it true? I think it must be true, but I'll have to check. Spencer's doubts about attending the memorial service for Charles Darwin, it was held in Westminster Abbey, so to attend the service, you'd have to enter through the portals of a church. And he was conflicted about doing that because he was rather hostile toward dogmatic Christianity, but after all, it was Charles Darwin. And I think he did actually attend the funeral. Well, Spencer, if you read Spencer carefully, you can see him making such references as a reference in I think his essays on education, a reference to the divinely ordained discipline of nature, so that even Spencer was an idealist. And then there's a counter instance that you might want to evoke, Huxley, I mean T.H. Huxley and not Julian Huxley, and you might want to say that he's an adherent of the evolutionary epic, but he doesn't conform to this idealist perspective that I'm attributing to the evolutionary epic. And I would say that actually he's not really an adherent of the evolutionary epic, because he actually makes a radical distinction. Ultimately, he makes a radical distinction between nature and society, and he conceptualizes society as a garden that is actually separated from nature. So Huxley is not an idealist, but he's not an adherent of the evolutionary epic either. And now I skip forward to, I want to come back in here with Wilson. I turn back now to E.O. Wilson's sociobiological version of the evolutionary epic. How does Wilson justify the evolutionary epic that he narrates? Wilson is certainly not at all an idealist. He does not even appear to be a closet idealist, as Spencer clearly was. Committing to idealism would have offered Wilson a justification for the evolutionary epic. And indeed, it is striking the extent to which, at the present moment, there are quite a few proponents of the evolutionary epic, and also of big history, which is very close to the evolutionary epic. There are quite a few proponents of the present-day evolutionary epic and of big history who actually appeal explicitly and directly to religion. Loyal, I've forgotten his name, I think Loyal Roy, is it? Loyal Rue, and there's Michael Dowd, Thank God for Evolution, How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and Our World. But that's not Wilson. That's another branch of the present-day evolutionary epic, which I think confirms my claim, tends to confirm my claim that to have an evolutionary epic, really, you have to have a kind of idealist, a substrate of idealist assumptions. But Wilson doesn't do that. He doesn't go that direction. In fact, Wilson is much more from out of the warfare of science and religion tradition of the late 19th century. So how then does Wilson justify his evolutionary epic? I cannot find, as something more than just myth. That's the question here, because we've seen he does give a justification, tries to justify it as a myth. And there may be something to that, actually, in what he says. Indeed, how can anyone in the 21st century claim with a straight face to offer a grand narrative of human history? After all, to acknowledge that in theory an evolutionary epic can be justified by appeal to the notion that a single divine purpose is at work in the world is not to establish that such a purpose exists, nor does it allow us to say that such and such a fixation in the particular evolutionary epic that is proposed really does represent the main line of natural and human history, nor does it even establish that there is such a thing as a main line at all. Why should there be a main line in history? In another context, I was once moved to write that all calls for synthesis are attempts to impose an interpretation. A fortiori, in this case, that statement holds true. This is a call for synthesis that is, in every case, I think, an attempt to impose some interpretation or other. But surely any interpretation needs to be argued for as such, not grounded on a story of the world that is itself ungrounded. So one suspects here a sleight of hand. One can, of course, nobody denies this, envisage a history focused on one or another very important problem, VIP, right, that might have resonance for all human beings, such as the problems arising from a human being's relation to a natural environment that they all share in common since they all live on the planet Earth, or the problem of achieving civil peace in particular places throughout the world. But Wilson's project claims to be more than an account of a very important problem. It claims to have things fundamentally right insofar as human life is concerned. It is the right view, even though it's not quite scientifically justified. Nonetheless, we are given substitutes for, or compensations for, the absence of an adequate and serious justification for the claims made for the Wilsonian evolutionary epic. We can find him giving justifications. In the latter category, the category of a compensation for a justification, is the assertion on Wilson's part that the evolutionary epic, while true, is also a myth. Now, I do not think that we can deny that human beings need myths, by which I mean stories to live by, with not so much attention paid as to whether the stories are true in a literal sense. But this fact does not allow us to evade questions as to the truth of the myth, as to what it leaves out, and as to its utility and how that utility would be achieved, or indeed how that utility could be demonstrated. I do concede that the results are not in. That's capitalization there. I do note that, for example, it seems that some aspects of evolutionary psychology, which the Wilsonian evolutionary epic has championed, have turned out apparently to be useful in applied social science. But here I'm inclined to think we should fixate on the specific discipline or disciplines and what it or they can do for us without being distracted by the intellectual equivalent of a bridge too far. And this because the evolutionary epic claims a kind of exclusivity, and this means that inevitably it suffers from blind spots that could well become dangerous if given the authority of, if the evolutionary epic is given the authority of being the authorized view. I'm all too aware of the way that the myths of nation states can become havens of ignorance and can serve for a long time to justify and to protect actions based on these myths from disconfirmation. And of course, one of the impulses behind big history is the attempt to replace the myths of nation states, but I think we have to understand that myths in general have problematic features. There's a final point that I need to make, and this concerns a very important difference between the 19th century evolutionary epic and the present-day variety on which I'm focusing here, namely Wilson's variety. The authors of the 19th century evolutionary epic were interested primarily in offering a worldview that they thought would be edifying and perhaps useful for the popular audience they had in mind. Present-day proponents of the evolutionary epic certainly want to do this as well, and I think that may be okay, actually. But those who are in the Wilsonian camp want to offer something else, something in addition. They want to offer a set of methodological prescriptions, a set of methodological prescriptions that they hope will transform the entire territory of research in the human sciences. In contrast to their 19th century predecessors, the proponents of the most influential versions of the present-day evolutionary epic, and that's the Wilsonian versions, are indeed concerned with offering methodological prescriptions. Their methodological concern, however, has a closer affinity with parts of 19th century positivism, and I say parts of 19th century positivism, than it does with the 19th century evolutionary epic. And really, there's an affinity with H.T. Buckle, who championed a nomothetic approach to human society, but there were other much more sophisticated positivists in the late 19th century in Europe who did not adhere to that sort of view. As is well known, the part of the positivist project which insisted that human society and culture can be satisfactorily explained, nomothetically, that is entirely in terms of laws of society modeled on the laws of Newtonian nature, met with only limited success. Attached to the Wilsonian evolutionary epic is a similar claim, albeit a claim that can rely on much more advanced forms of physical, biological, and psychological science than were available to 19th century positivists. Behind the hope for the success of the methodological claim of the new evolutionary epic lies the thought that the realm of human ideas, culture, thought, and purpose can be ultimately entirely explained in the same terms as can the realm of non-thinking, non-purposive nature. Cross-cultural generalizations arising from the study of physical and biological human nature in general can generate sufficiently good results, as I interpret what the evolutionary epic is saying, that they can serve the purposes of explanation and administration in sharply different human societies and contexts. For at the end of the day, they are all similar enough, that is to say, people are all similar enough, that the same arrangements can be functional beyond all differences of a human culture. It may be so, of course. After all, the air traffic control system, I wrote this before, the most recent loss of the Malaysian airplane. It may be so, of course. After all, the air traffic control system and many other systems operate, and most of the time operate reasonably well across cultural boundaries. Certainly, there are things that we can learn from the generalizing tendency that lies behind the evolutionary epics, old and new. But both the old epic and the new one depend on assumptions, at base on metaphysical assumptions, that their proponents have not adequately examined. Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest which assumes a single standard of fitness transcending different environments, is one of the hallmarks of the evolutionary epic Old and New. Perhaps, indeed, it is the chief hallmark. I do not see how it is justified, least of all in the realm of human society and culture, which seems always to throw surprises in our direction. So that's it.
Thanks a lot for that, Allan. Before I throw it open to questions, could I get, if people are going to leave, to go out the back door? Back door? Back door? Okay. Yeah, I've been told we need to leave out of the rear door. I'm not sure why, but anyways, hopefully most of you will stay till the end of the questions, and you'll still have to leave out the rear door. But so Paul's got a microphone, and yeah, we have a few minutes. So please, Jack.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk, Jack Soames, University of Western Sydney. You said, I think it was kind of near the start of the talk, that one of the things that Wilson wanted to do with this story is that you've got to derive some ethics out of it to replace, the ethics inherent in old cosmologies. And I think the quote you provided was that these will be the ethical premises inherent in man's biological nature. But that seems to me to be the most kind of slippery and difficult thing to pull out of the story. You kind of plot the basic trajectory, but then what that all means is kind of the fundamental contestation. So I guess I'm wondering specifically, what does Wilson say about this? But also, this recalls to my mind Peter Kropotkin and his kind of theory, which I'm not sure if you're aware of, this big evolutionary story where he emphasized, it's published in 1902, I think, and specifically against the kind of Spencerian idea of survival of the fittest, where what fit means kind of socially cooperative. So he's kind of he uses this as an argument for socialism. So it's like a really interesting attempt. That's two different kind of questions, I suppose.
I'm not tremendously familiar with Kropotkin. I think of him as being anarchistically oriented. I'm glad you mentioned Spencer, because I think Spencer is relevant here. And I would have to take a look, I think I'll have to Google search Wilson for ethics. When he suggested ethics can be derived, I can't remember the precise quotation now, but it's from the material world. That's really very, very Spencerian. And in a way, it's a kind of unacknowledged, completely unacknowledged closet idealism. And what could justify it? It could be justified if you assume that God created the world and somehow embedded ethics in the structure of the material world, in the structure of nature. But I have a hard time seeing how it could be justified otherwise. And I don't know how Wilson, or whether Wilson, investigates and develops.
That's a massive throwaway if he doesn't actually sort of address it. Oh, we all know what
right.
he said about
Right, we just take it as given.
Yeah, sure.
But it's obviously.
Not from you, I mean from Wilson. No.
Yeah. Right. Yes, of course. If he'd studied philosophy in secondary school instead of going out writing names, maybe he wouldn't have said that.
I've been told that we have to leave the room at about 3:30. Maybe we can stay a bit longer, but we've only got about 10 minutes for questions. So, way at the back there.
Just want to carry on the reference to Prince Kropotkin, whose book Mutual Aid, I think, provides an extremely relevant perspective on the social uses of these evolutionary stories, because although competition, struggle for survival between individuals was much emphasized, if you look instead of competition between individuals, you look at cooperation within the parts of any one individual, i.e. cooperation between their different cells, their different organs and so on, you can see immediately that in relationship to the view perspective.
Yes, I think that's a very reasonable, and Lightman's not the only person to make that kind of observation. I mean, there was a tendency in some social theory after Darwin to emphasize competition among groups, between groups rather than between individuals, and by the same token to emphasize cooperation within groups. Of course, one still has struggle, but there's also cooperation occupying a basic place. But it's hard to know how to fit that within Darwin's theory of 1859. The descent of man is different.
Everyone needs to speak on that.
Oh, I have to stay behind.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here I am. Yes. We know.
Sapkowski.
Yeah, okay.
Very quick and basic. Lyle, an idealist? I don't think so.
Well, let me tell, okay, let me answer. And, I teach Lyle to my students. Oh, damn, sorry, I shouldn't have said that, and I'm really breaking the rules. Of course, he is methodologically a positivist, and that's the most overwhelmingly visible thing in the principles of geology. But it is subtended by idealist assumptions. And when he says the author of nature doing blah, 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 I think that's really Lyle speaking. I don't think it's just a form of language.
Right, okay, so I was going to ask, why does Darwin get off the hook and we say, oh yeah, well we can just rewrite the origin without that stuff, but Lyle doesn't get off the hook. Okay, but if it's subtended in Lyle, in what direction is it subtended? It's not really subtended in any particular direction. I found it odd that he was in that group of four.
Okay.
It sort of felt like one of those is not like the others. Because, Lyle talks about stations. I think, Lyle's ecology, and his, ecological understanding of what we would call niche, filling and adaptation is really important. It's really important for Darwin. Yeah. And for Darwin's understanding of what variation is and why it's something that needs to be explained. So Linnaeus, right, also talks about stations, but those stations are filled by creatures that have been designed and put there by God. Well, yeah. But Lyle talks about stations, but not at all. Those stations are can be vacated by organisms that don't succeed and filled. And the whole thing, as goes in a circle without going anywhere particularly. So I'm just
because Lyle insists that they do not evolve. The organisms don't evolve. They I think he's ambiguous about, did they all come into being at the beginning, or did God? I don't know. But in any case, some of them disappear. But he spends all that energy denying that there can be transmutation of species.
We'll have a beer and argue about it later.
Yeah, okay.
I'll give it up to somebody else for now.
That's a great one. Time for one more. Chris?
Thanks, Chris Oldfield, King's College London. Fascinating talk, really resonates with my own interests, very much so. I wonder if you might comment on Nietzsche particularly. What I find so relentless in Nietzsche is this coming together of a sense that he's finally got the insight. He's the first psychologist, he's the first physicist, he's the first guy to take our apparatus and turn it back on itself. So you have this kind of collision of enlightenment and sort of, he seems swept in the ideal, but it kind of comes in on itself, Yes. And I just wonder, so I just wonder if you could comment on that you present him at once as the kind of the anti-idealist, right? But at the same time, he presents himself as the forerunner, the guy, the coming of age. Do you see what I'm headed?
Yes, I think your insight into Nietzsche, your intuition is, in my view, correct, though that's not really a Nietzschean thing to say. It's fundamentally right. Jaspers once said that for every Satz in Nietzsche, there's a Gegensatz. That there's, he'll say A, and then he'll say not A. And actually, when I got into this project and reread Morgenrothe, it's translated in different ways into English, so that's why I said Morgan wrote The Dawn of Day, dawn, daybreak. I was very surprised by what he was saying about Darwinism, because there are other places where he says exactly the opposite about, he interprets Darwinism and Darwin and his school in exactly the opposite way. And he gets Darwin absolutely wrong. But of course, he never read Darwin. He never actually read Darwin, except I think one essay, and that was it. So yes, I think you're right. I would not want to say that what I've given you here is a fragment of the true Nietzsche, because I don't think there is the true Nietzsche. And I think that's the point, except that it isn't, because there can't be the point in Nietzsche. I wrote about Nietzsche years ago and said things very different from what I'm said today about Nietzsche. But that doesn't bother me. Oh, I think it would. Yeah, it would bother him. Everything bothered him.